It's The Big Take from Bloomberg News and iHeartRadio. I'm Wes Kosova. Today, how COVID exposed the dangers of heavily sedating patients in the hospital. In the early days of the COVID pandemic, this is before vaccines, people with severe cases who went to the intensive care unit were often placed on ventilators to keep them alive. Doctors heavily sedated many of these patients so they could stay calm and rest. And that invasive treatment helped a lot of COVID patients survive. But it came at a cost. Being under it on heavy drugs for days or weeks has now left many of them with lasting physical and mental health impairments.
I did not sleep well. I would get panic attacks during the day. And I didn't attribute them to PTSD or anything. I just figured I've been through this, and now it's just sort of trailing off into the sunset.
That's Kelly McCarthy. She spent weeks on a ventilator as a result of COVID and lived. But she now faces a very different life. We'll hear more of her story a bit later. First, a conversation with Dr. Wes Ely. He's a pulmonologist and critical care physician at Vanderbilt University Medical School, and he's seen up close the effects of sedation on patients. He's also the author of the book Every Deep Drawn Breath, a critical care doctor on healing, recovery, and transforming medicine in the ICU. Doctor, in the early days of COVID, very sick patients were going to the hospital and doctors were trying to figure out what to do. There weren't a lot of answers, and sometimes people were being very heavily sedated. You've spent decades studying the effects of sedation. Can you explain the difference between the proper use of sedation and when it's overused?
Yes, when you come in the ICU and you have to get life support like a ventilator, it makes sense that as a doctor, I would want to provide my patient with a level of comfort that sometimes comes with unconsciousness, and so a sedative drug. But what we've learned over 25 to 30 years of research, Wes, thousands and thousands of patients in NIH and federally funded studies, is that we can really cause a lot of harm to our patients by giving them too much sedation for too long. And so what we have done is randomized trials over the years where we've proven that people can actually be more likely to live on the back end of critical illness if we shorten the sedation, give them less, and overall don't burden them with drugs like benzodiazepines, which were really common during COVID, unfortunately.
You worked as a critical care physician in those early days. They were kind of scary. There weren't vaccines yet. What sort of practices did you see that you've now learned weren't actually best practices?
I'm going to tell you through the story of a patient. I had a patient named Teresa Martin, and I have permission to use her name. In 1990, I cared for her with a pattern of sedation, which was heavy, immobilizing, put her in a coma for many days. And then for the next 25 years, I did research to try and figure out, with the rest of us around the world, how do we keep people more awake, more alert, more in communication with their family members, and earlier mobilized. And we had made all this progress until 2019. We had more people living, they were living with less disabilities, etc. And then COVID hit, Wes. I'm standing in the ICU, in the COVID ICU, caring for a man named Fred Reyes. I also have permission to use his name. And he was on the ventilator, and I thought to myself, oh my gosh, this is deja vu. I'm back in 1990 with Teresa Martin. We have regressed 30 years in our practices. And that's exactly what happened globally. We proved in a study of 2,100 COVID ICU patients that we were overusing benzos and underusing family, and this was creating a massive amount of acute brain dysfunction and accelerating death during COVID.
You said you were overusing benzos, these very powerful sedatives, and underusing families. What exactly do you mean by that?
The best way to keep somebody's brain online or on track when they're critically ill is to give them a little bit of sedation at the beginning on the ventilator. We do need sedation at the beginning when we first put somebody on the ventilator. But it's on day 2 or day 3 or day 4 where we need to be waking people up every single day to allow them to look in the eyes of their wife, their spouse, their husband, whatever it may be, so they can remember, oh, I have a reason to live. And they're getting by with a very scary how in the ICU. They have lines and tubes and they can't talk, and they need to see their family and they need to be able to process that. Well, during COVID, we pummeled them with benzodiazepines. There was a paper early on in the New England Journal of Medicine that showed that 86% of COVID patients were getting benzodiazepines like Ativan or midazolam. And just prior to COVID, we had pretty much gotten rid of those drugs altogether. They cause a tremendous amount of delirium and harm, and so we don't like to use those on people.
And so why were they used so frequently in COVID? Why did they bring these drugs back? What was it about COVID care that sort of threw the rule book out the window?
Just prior to COVID, we had a safety checklist in the ICU. It's called the ABCDEF bundle. We call it the A to F bundle. That essentially was wake people up, get them out of bed, and have their family there. Well, at the beginning of COVID, when I wasn't vaccinated and no one else was vaccinated, we were afraid to have family members come in. So we kept family away. We kept the patient in the room. We shut the door, and we had the patient behind the glass. They had a tube down their throat. So to make them not able to pull that tube out and take themselves off of a ventilator, which we call self-extubation, we snowed them with benzos because they are the deepest coma-laden drug that we could give them. And also the drug propofol. Those were the drugs that we were using because we had to keep the person so deeply in a coma since we weren't free to go in and out of the room as much as we wanted to.
When that happened, family members weren't allowed in. Doctors and other members of the care team weren't able to check as frequently. What did we learn about what the effects were both for the treatment of COVID and after people recovered?
We were doing the best we could with the light we had at the time. Now we know that vaccines work and that personal protective equipment, PPE, works. It was anti-medicine. It was a time when we couldn't have the families there. But what we learned were two main things. When we put all those COVID patients deeply into sedative coma, like we had been back in the 1990s, it increased dementia. It increases a problem called post-intensive care syndrome, which is PICS, or the so-called PICS. And on the back end of the ICU stay, if somebody survives, what they land with in their life is big-time cognitive impairment, memory impairment, the inability to do their job. They also have way more in the terms of muscle and nerve disease, and then more depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So we were exacerbating, if you will, the likelihood of them getting post-intensive care syndrome and having all these disabilities in the months and years after they tried to recover from their COVID.
So for decades, you have studied this. You actually wrote the rule book when it comes to how to properly sedate patients with other physicians you work with. Knowing what you know now from the experience treating and sedating COVID patients, have you changed the rules or added to them in a way using this experience to improve care in the future?
We absolutely have. What we have done is we have said, okay, we don't need to start from scratch. We have 25 years of randomized controlled trials and cohort studies. We don't have to start over. So what we've done is we've worked nationally and internationally with intensive care societies, and we're taking the ABCDEF bundle, the A2F bundle, and we're re-implementing it on a large scale all over the world to say the next time we have a pandemic like this, we are going to make sure that we do not abandon all of this data, which we know saves lives, reduces length of stay, cuts down cost of care, and helps people survive without an acquired dementia. And so that's what we're doing to move forward, both currently in the peri-pandemic period of COVID, because there's still hundreds of people in the ICUs with COVID right now, although the numbers are way down, and we're going to have another pandemic. We just need to make sure we do it more safely next time.
So, Doctor, we're talking about COVID and a possible future pandemic, but just in normal life, if one of our listeners, a member of their family, falls ill and requires sedation and they're in the hospital, what can people do to make sure that the sedation they're getting does follow these rules and that they're going down the right path instead of a less fortunate one?
First of all, if you are with a loved one who is in the ICU and on a ventilator, then you are their advocate. And I want you to know that it is okay to be their advocate and to request to be present at the bedside. These days of limited visitation should be over, and they are wrong. And you should challenge that and say, I need to be with my loved one because they need an advocate, and they need to make eye contact with me so they can remember that they have a why to live. We can't heal people, Wes, with just science. It's over. We know that we have to have humanism and science. We need physical touch and that personal humanistic approach plus the science. That's how we completely heal a human being. So that loved one should say, I want to be on rounds. Let me listen to what you're doing and give me a lay explanation of what's happening. I will tell you what my loved one needs. I know what matters to them. And I call this, Wes, flipping the preposition. It's not just about what's the matter with someone. It's what matters to someone. So I have to have the family members there with me to tell me what Mr. Smith, what's important to him and how far I should push different types of interventions, how aggressively I should make that he wakes up every day. Should we try and get him hearing his granddaughter today? Is she the most important person who's going to help him have, the reason to live? We're going to take this humanistic approach and put it alongside the science, and we need the family there to make that happen.
Dr. Wes Ely, thanks so much for talking to me today.
My privilege. Thank you for having me.
After the break, the widespread effects of heavy sedation on patients. Bloomberg senior editor and biosecurity correspondent Jason Gale joins me now from Melbourne, Australia. You have written this very interesting story about what's really a side effect, and a very serious one, of COVID treatment, especially in the early days before the vaccine, when people were sedated and often sedated to keep them on ventilators. You write in your story about a woman named Kelly McCarthy. Can you tell us about her?
Kelly McCarthy is a woman now 52 years old. She's a grandmother. She was previously working full-time as an insurance claims adjuster just outside of Boston. She got sick with COVID in early 2021. It was actually around the peak of the pandemic, the pandemic's first winter wave in the US.
I remember I was feeling very crummy, just like a regular bug or something. And so I went and I got soup and whatever's. I was going to nurse it on my own. Finally, one day, I'm just like, I can't get out of bed. My husband comes in and goes, you're going to urgent care if I have to throw you over my shoulder. So we did, and my oxygen, I guess, was like in the 50s somewhere. It's supposed to not go below 90. And and everyone in the room went, oh, so I knew it was bad. So then they took me to the hospital, and I was in the ICU for I want to say 3 days.
Very quickly, they worked out that she had COVID and tried to give her supplemental oxygen. But after a few days, they realized that she needed to go onto a mechanical ventilator.
I was intubated twice, and they tried 3 times to extubate me. But I guess I started getting really agitated, swinging and trying to whatever. So then they decided to do a tracheostomy, So my little bar fight scar. But they just said, we can't keep doing this, and her lungs won't work on their own. And that's when they started working on my family, saying she's going to be hooked up to something for the rest of her life. And the only thing I had was some extra oxygen when I got home. So that was nice.
We think of people when they're sedated as being asleep. But what you describe that Kelly McCarthy and other patients experienced is this sort of sleeping wakefulness where they were aware they were having really bad dreams and they could feel themselves fighting the ventilator despite the sedation.
So sedation isn't exactly sleep in the way we know sleep. It's really an altered state of consciousness. So in the case of Kelly McCarthy, she was given multiple different agents for sedation, for pain relief, and to essentially paralyze her. There were periods over the many weeks in which she was on a mechanical ventilator in which she was not asleep and she was kind of conscious of things going on around her, and it fed into her consciousness, and she essentially started hallucinating all kinds of different, sometimes horrific things.
While I was under, I had the most horrifying nightmares, but I wasn't all the way under. So reality was working its way into my dreams. I was in a room, and a hospital room, go figure. And the doctor's like, hi, Kelly, do you know me? I just intubated you, whatever. And I looked at her, and She said, okay, so I'm going to kill you in my dream. I doubt she said that in ICU.
One of the other ironies of this story is that these treatments, though some of them were very difficult for the patients, led to a higher survival rate than we've seen in previous pandemics, certainly in 1918, the influenza pandemic. And so the very thing that kept them alive is something that has pointed up big problems with people being heavily sedated.
Yeah, absolutely. We are now dealing with the after effects of so many people, at least 250,000 patients in the US who survived their intensive care for COVID. And a majority of them will have some degree of impairment following that.
I don't drive at this point because if my legs are kicking out from underneath me, I don't want them kicking out behind the wheel because that could be a real problem. I forget things, and so that's difficult because I'll be like, oh, I got to look that up on Google, pick up my phone, put it back down. I have no idea. Apparently it wasn't terribly important. But stuff like that, holding things without dropping them, that's fun. But only if my hands get to like that. They gave me surgery. I had carpal tunnel in both hands from the fluid that they filled me with, and I guess it impinged the nerves. And because of that, my hands hurt so much at the time, and I couldn't feel them.
So the impairments really go from the head to the toes. It's all kinds of things. There's mental, cognitive impairments to do, obviously, with the brain. There is often lung scarring, muscle weakness, dental issues. Often patients, it's hard to clean their teeth, for example. Patients can get bed sores. They essentially get what's called post-intensive care syndrome. And that is this sort of umbrella term for really a large raft of problems that can be quite enduring.
My conversation with Jason Gale continues after the break. Jason, you write in your story that even though Kelly is grateful to be alive, her life is now entirely different than it was before.
It really is. Her daughter Rachel mentioned that she was previously working multiple jobs, working sometimes 70 to 90 hours per week. She's now unable to work at all, and the outlook for her working isn't good. And this is a woman who is in her early 50s. She didn't expect to have to, retire so young.
It's just the isolation. It's not even the financial, because we do all right, so that's fine. But it's like, I would go to work every day and see my friends and enjoy them and chit-chat and talk to people and do my work or whatever. I don't have that anymore. I don't go out, really. I'll go out to see my kids, my grandkids, whatever, run errands. But since I don't drive, I've got to wait for a ride.
So it's had a profound effect on her professionally, but even, socially and economically, and not just Kelly, but the rest of the family.
It has affected me.
That's Kelly McCarthy's mother, Brenda Reed.
I still get choked up, but what I find is I can be driving along in the car and just listening to music that has nothing to do with anything, and all of a sudden it will hit me and I will feel very sad, only for a moment, but there's still those little flashes, and I suspect those will go on for a while. I don't know how long, but it says to me that if something like that is affecting me, I can't even begin to imagine how it must be for the child, the woman who went through all of this first person.
And I think it's important to note that when a patient does spend a lot of time in the ICU, the flow-on effects across families is quite profound. A study from France showed that about a third of relatives of ICU COVID patients suffered PTSD as a result.
And in the case of Kelly McCarthy, the woman you write about in your story, she was thought to be dying, and the medical team called her family to say it may be time to say goodbye. And in fact, her life was saved simply by reducing the amount of sedation she was on?
Yeah, so initially, Kelly McCarthy was treated in a county hospital, essentially, and her acute respiratory distress syndrome just got worse and worse to the point where it looked like her respiratory failure would become fatal. And so her family was called in to say goodbye.
We did go and see her. We did say our goodbyes, but I told her to hang on because we were working on something that would be beneficial to her, and she couldn't hear us, or we didn't know if she could hear us. As I say, she was unconscious.
Around the same time, Brenda, Kelly's mother, learned that double lung transplants were occurring and may offer some life-saving benefit for Kelly. And so calls were made to the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston to have Kelly transferred.
I had seen a story where at Brigham and Women's they had a lung center, and there was a man, I believe he was from Nebraska, had come in, both lungs were gone because of COVID. He had transplants, he survived, he was home in Nebraska doing quite well and recovering. And so we said to the doctor, we want her transferred.
I spoke to Daniela Lamas, an intensive care doctor who took over Kelly's care, and she realized that Kelly's lungs weren't the main problem. She just, as Daniela Lamas said, needed to have her sedation turned off or turned down slowly. And over the course of the next week or two, they did titrate down all her sedation and opioids and things, and eventually she was able to come off the mechanical ventilator.
What do you take away from all this about the lessons that have been learned from this, and how in the future the harm that can come from this sort of treatment, the well-intended, can cause?
So talking to a lot of folks working in ICUs in different capacities, it seems as though we can never not allow family caregivers back into the ICUs, that we need to figure out a way of keeping that a very important component of intensive care back in the ICU. So that is something that we've really learned from this pandemic, that it's so important to keep family members there in the room with patients.
She's just a funny person, but a sensitive person and a kind person. And I watch her now, and I always knew she was strong and brave, but I watch her now as recovery continues, but at a snail's pace, unfortunately. And the recovery in the end may not be exactly what she had hoped for, but she's doing better now than she was in the beginning. And her sense of humor does bring her through. But it's funny because there'll be days when I'll be talking to her and she's very bubbly and upbeat. And I'll say, okay, you're having a bad day, aren't you? And she'd say, why? Why do you think that? I said, I'm your mother. And when you're upset, you're extremely bubbly and outgoing. And she went, yes, I guess I'm having a bad day. So they are in there, but her coping mechanism is positively amazing.
You can read Jason Gale's story about COVID and sedation at Bloomberg.com. Jason, Gale, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Thanks for having me, Wes. It's good to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to us here at The Big Take. It's a daily podcast from Bloomberg and iHeartRadio. For more shows from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Read today's story and subscribe to our daily newsletter at Bloomberg.com/BigTake. And we'd love to hear from you. Email us with questions or comments to bigtake@bloomberg.net. The supervising producer of The Big Take is Vicky Bergalina. Our senior producer is Catherine Fink. Our producer is Federica Romaniello. Our associate producer is Zenib Siddiqui. Hilda Garcia is our engineer. Original music by Leo Sidran. I'm Wes Kosova. We'll be back tomorrow with another Big Take.